There is a particular kind of silence that settles into a place after something has gone terribly wrong. Not the absence of sound itself, but the presence of something unspoken, something that lingers in the air as though the space remembers what happened within it. And in the quiet suburban town of Maple Grove, Minnesota, that silence did not arrive all at once, nor did it announce itself in a way that demanded immediate attention, but instead unfolded slowly, almost patiently, woven into the ordinary details of a life that appeared, from the outside, entirely unchanged, until it became impossible to ignore the unsettling truth that what had happened inside that house had not been sudden or chaotic, but deliberate, controlled, and hidden within the very routines that were meant to keep everything predictable. In a neighborhood defined by its quiet symmetry, where identical houses stood in careful rows and the rhythm of life moved with a reassuring consistency, Hannah Reeves lived in a modest two-story home that reflected her preference for order, routine, and a sense of calm that she had cultivated over years of living alone, working as an accountant whose days were structured around precision and whose evenings were shaped by habits so consistent that they had become almost automatic. She was 37 years old, known to her colleagues as dependable and meticulous, and to her neighbors as polite but reserved. Someone who maintained a comfortable distance from the world around her while still remaining a part of it. And it was within this carefully balanced life that something began to shift. Not in a way that could be easily identified, but in a way that would later reveal itself as the beginning of something far more disturbing than anyone could have anticipated. On the evening of January 12th, Hannah returned home at exactly 6:05 p.m. Her arrival marked by the quiet sound of her car pulling into the driveway and the soft click of the front door closing behind her. And as she moved through the familiar sequence of her routine, placing her belongings in their usual places and preparing a simple dinner, there was nothing to suggest that anything was out of the ordinary. At 7:14 p.m., she spoke briefly with her mother on the phone, discussing plans for an upcoming visit, her voice calm and unhurried. And when the call ended, it did so with the same sense of normalcy that had defined every interaction that day. By 8:32 p.m., she had settled into the living room, where she spent the remainder of the evening reviewing documents on her laptop, occasionally glancing at the television in the background. And at 9:47 p.m., she sent a final email to a client, closing out her work for the day with the same precision that defined her professional life. That email would later become one of the last confirmed actions she took. What followed was not immediately understood, because the events that unfolded that night did not leave behind the kind of evidence that typically signals something has gone wrong, and instead, they blended seamlessly into the continuity of her routine, creating an illusion that would persist for days. The following morning, Hannah's work account showed activity. At 8:12 a.m., a login was recorded. At 8:26 a.m., a document was opened. At 9:03 a.m., an email was sent. And yet, Hannah Reeves was no longer alive. The realization did not come immediately, because nothing about the digital activity appeared unusual, and it was only when her responses began to slow, then stop entirely, that concern began to take hold, growing steadily until it prompted a welfare check that would reveal a reality far more unsettling than anyone had anticipated. When officers entered Hannah's home, they found a scene that appeared almost untouched, as though the house itself had been preserved in a moment of normalcy. The kitchen clean, the living room orderly, and her belongings exactly where they should have been. And yet, there was an absence that could not be ignored. Hannah was found in the bedroom, lying beside the bed, her body positioned in a way that suggested a sudden collapse rather than a prolonged struggle. And while there were no visible signs of trauma, the autopsy would later confirm that she had died from asphyxiation, a method that leaves behind very little immediate evidence of the act itself. The investigation that followed was defined by a single, unsettling question. How had someone entered the home, committed the crime, and left without leaving behind any clear trace? And it was this question that led investigators to examine not just the physical evidence, but the patterns of behavior that had preceded the event. What they discovered was a detail so small it had initially gone unnoticed. A series of maintenance visits, routine, scheduled, unremarkable. Over the course of several weeks, a man named Derek Lawson, who worked as a local utility technician, had visited Hannah's home multiple times, each visit brief, each interaction professional, and each one providing him with an opportunity to observe the layout of the house, the structure of her routine, and the moments when she was most vulnerable. What made this discovery particularly significant was not just the frequency of the visits, but the access they provided, because Derek had been inside the home, had seen its interior, and had identified details that others would not have noticed, including a secondary entrance that was rarely used and a lock that did not fully engage unless it was checked manually. On the night of January 12th, Derek returned. He did not force entry. He did not create a disturbance. He simply used what he already knew. The confrontation that followed was brief, controlled, and devastatingly quiet, leaving behind no immediate signs of struggle, and after it was over, he did something that would transform the case from a crime into something far more unsettling. He stayed. Using Hannah's laptop and phone, he logged into her accounts, sent emails, opened documents, and maintained the illusion that she was still alive, extending the timeline of her presence and delaying the moment when anyone would realize what had happened. He continued her life, at least in appearance. The digital evidence, once analyzed in detail, revealed subtle inconsistencies, small deviations in typing patterns, slight delays in response times, and changes in phrasing that suggested something was not quite right, leading investigators to identify Derek Lawson as the primary suspect. When he was arrested and questioned, his confession revealed a mindset defined not by impulse, but by calculation, describing his actions as a sequence of decisions that had been shaped by observation, familiarity, and a disturbing sense of control, as though what he had done was not an act of violence, but the execution of a plan that had been forming over time. Derek Lawson was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment, but the case left behind something far more difficult to resolve than the question of guilt. It left behind a shift in perception. Because what happened to Hannah Reeves did not involve a dramatic intrusion or a visible act of violence, but instead unfolded within the quiet boundaries of routine, exploiting familiarity, trust, and the assumption that safety exists in what feels known. And even now, in homes where routines continue uninterrupted and digital activity creates the illusion of presence, there remains a possibility that is as unsettling as it is difficult to ignore. That sometimes the days that seem to continue have already ended.